Welcome back to Food Done Right, an original podcast series brought to you by GIY. I'm Mick Kelly, the founder of GIY, and on this episode we're bringing you one of the panel discussions that we hosted at the Harvest Festival in Waterford City. The panel was entitled Global Shocks, Local Impact, and I was delighted to be joined by John Gibbons, an environmental activist, Irish Times columnist and a weekly contributor on Matt Cooper's The Last Word on Today FM, by Dr. Steve Collins, a medical doctor with a PhD in nutrition. He won an MBE for his humanitarian work in Africa and has recently returned to live in Ireland and is now growing Aronia berries on the side of a mountain in West Cork. Kitty Scully, who's a writer, presenter and well-known gardener. She has recently been to South Africa as part of her study and research in regenerative agriculture. She's also co-ordinator of the Organic Growers Ireland and a presenter of Homegrown on RTE1. And finally by Richard Mee, our own head grower at Grow HQ here in Waterford. Richard previously grew veg for restaurants and joined our panel today. We were discussing the global issues that have been affecting us in recent years at a local level, reflecting on how the COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine and climate change have impacted our food systems, and exploring what we can do to become more resilient and diverse in our local food systems. John, I'm going to go to you first if I can, and maybe if you could paint a little bit of a picture for us about what your sense is of what those big sort of global crises that we've had over the last few years and what the impact has been around the food system, if you could speak to that a little bit.
I suppose to kick off, you think of the 5 hottest years on the instrumental record. This is basically going back to the 1880s worldwide. The 5 hottest years in the instrumental record have all happened since 2017. Okay, so what we know for sure is the world is heating up really fast. We've also just seen the summer of 2022 as the hottest summer ever recorded in Europe. We've just had the hottest August ever recorded in Europe. And I would point out that this is during what's called a La Nina phase. We're supposed to be in a cyclical global cooling phase. Probably next year we're going to get an El Nino, which means that whatever happened in Europe this year is going to be a lot warmer in all probability next year. So we're moving into a phase of, I guess we can call it climate destabilization, where the climate system is finally beginning, as projected, to respond to what we've been throwing at it year after year, decade after decade. And to put those into numbers, every year we're adding the equivalent of about 36,000 million tonnes of a trace greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. We've changed the chemistry of the planet. We now have 50% more carbon dioxide in our atmosphere than at any time in the last 3 million years. And that 50% additional basically is the human impact. And that means that we now live effectively on a different planet than people lived on 100 years ago or 200 years ago, arguably even 50 years ago, because this is an exponential process and it's accumulating so quickly. And the thing to understand about CO2 is that CO2 is basically forever in human terms. All the CO2 that was emitted 50 years ago is warming the planet today, almost all of it. The CO2 that is emitted today will be warming the planet in 100, 500 and 1,000 years. Now, to come to Michael's question, what does this mean? This means that we are the stable conditions of the last 10,000 years that gave rise to, I guess, human thriving. The so-called Holocene period is basically over. We're now exiting that period really quickly. And the reason that that's important and the reason we're talking about it this morning is the Holocene was fantastically great for one thing. Well, for humans mostly. But the one thing it was fantastic for was agriculture. Because those stable climatic conditions allowed human agriculture to spread across the face of the world and, of course, to feed a burgeoning human population. Now, you could argue that we may have burgeoned a little bit too far, but that's a separate discussion. We are where we are, approaching 8 billion humans, 80 billion farmed animals. 8 billion humans, 80 billion farmed animals. All of that vast hoard requires enormous resources to be fed and to be sustained. Those resources require a stable climatic system, stable, predictable systems. As we touch certain thresholds, what you find is basically that system stops working. So you get, for example, seeds being sterilized. If at a certain part of their cycle, temperatures are persistently above 35 degrees centigrade, entire crops become sterilized. So we're rapidly approaching those thresholds for agriculture. We're also approaching human thresholds. Pakistan, earlier this year, temperatures touched and slightly exceeded 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, there is another concept called the wet bulb temperature, which isn't that well known, but it's coming to be known. And a wet bulb temperature, basically, of 35 degrees centigrade. Let me explain what that means. Wet bulb temperature means 100% humidity and 35 degrees centigrade. At a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees, all mammals die. Doesn't matter if you're sitting in the shade drinking cool water, you'll die. On our current trajectory, large swathes of the earth, about 20% of the earth, that currently houses or homes about 3 billion people, are heading for wet bulb temperatures above 30 degrees and approaching 35 degrees over the next 3 decades. So that means either people move or people die in extraordinary numbers. That's the choice that we face. Actually, we do have another choice, and that is to stop burning fossil fuels and burning our world down. So, but as I said, pertinent to this morning, why this is also relevant is that our food system is creaking at the moment. It is absolutely creaking, and it's approaching those limits. I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, thanks, John. That's an incredibly sobering start. Like Emmanuel Macron, I think about 2 weeks ago, he said it's the end of the age of abundance. Do you think that that's correct?
Yes, I think the age of abundance probably ended 50 years ago, but inertia has kind of pushed us forward into. I don't know if people remember the cartoon character, the coyote. You remember he's always after the roadrunner, and he'd run off a cliff, and he'd look left and he'd look right, but for a moment he hovered. I think we're in that coyote phase of this version of civilization.
Yeah. Okay, and we all know what comes after the hovering phase. So, Steve, maybe to bring you in at this point, like I suppose we live in a country that we're kind of blessed with, I suppose, an abundance of food, both the stuff we produce ourselves and imported food as well. Like the sort of, I suppose, food uncertainty that you would have seen working in Africa, obviously. But now as a farmer in Ireland, do you think, does that ring true for you, the end of the age of abundance?
Yeah, thanks, Mick. Yes, I mean, people always used to talk about, environmentalists are being sort of over-worried and there's sort of hysteria. But certainly working in Africa for the last 35 years, I'm seeing places that used to be really productive turn into desert. So my first job was in 1985 in a place called El Janaina, which in Arabic means the garden, because it was a very green, fertile place. There was elephants roaming. By 85, when I was working there, it was semi-desert, but it was still, you could grow. They had farmers. There was pastoralists around. But then by 2004, it was where the genocide was in the west of Sudan, and you probably heard about the genocide. And the genocide at the time was, this is a genocide because the Janjaweed that were funded by the government were wiping out the other tribe, and it was termed as a war. But actually, it was a climate conflict, because what had happened, the farming had been destroyed essentially, and so that the stable agricultural farmers had to farm more and more land to support their families, and the pastoralists who used to move between the communities had less and less land to move their animals on, and they needed bigger ranges. So it was purely climate change causing pressure on the population because of changing agricultural patterns. And now 35 years later, I'm in Ireland, and I'm starting to see the same thing. In West Cork, where I live in the hills above Bantry. Essentially, we monocrop grass, whether it's for sheep or whether it's for cattle. And you're seeing now, I've only been farming there since 2008, but already I've seen 2 or 3 very bad years where the price of a bale of silage has gone from, say, 20 euros once in, I think it's 2012, up to 60 euro. And that is really, if you've got a herd of dairy cattle and you need 10 bales of silage a day and they triple in price. That has massive impacts. It means you are non-viable. And in my opinion, what we've seen is that these forms of agriculture, monocropping grass, and we're talking about the inertia here, they've been allowed to persist because of the grant system. And the grant system has allowed non-viable agriculture, where I am, to persist. And those grants are changing. The next round of grants are changing. But there's no sort of leadership, it seems to me, on how they can change. So in the way in Africa now, most development programs will be talking to farmers and saying, look, in the face of climate change, you have to diversify your agriculture into types of agriculture that are more appropriate for a changing climate. And we've been saying that over in Africa for years. But actually, I think that same lesson applies in Ireland, that we can no longer monocrop grass that's rain-fed and expect the rain to come. Even this year in the summer, grass rates dropped off hugely because we had a real dry period. And if you've got loads of cattle and your grass rates drop off, you've got no silage in the winter, what do you do? And that's what we see in Africa. Then you sell your animals and the price of animals drops because everyone's selling animals. That's exactly the same patterns we're seeing. And so I think, it's time that farmers here actually started to think, what can I diverse to and how can I diversify my agriculture away from grass-fed monocropping?
We still, I think, tend to look at all the bad news on TV about climate shocks around the world. We're looking at Pakistan at the moment underwater and so on. I think we're still in the mindset of that's something that's happening over there and not over here. But can you speak a little bit about how the changing climate has impacted the growing that we're doing in Grow HQ and what you're seeing elsewhere? Like what is the practical kind of changes that are happening on the ground for you?
The biggest change is uncertainty. I've been growing for a number of years, quite a number, over 50 actually now. But what we used to have as a reliable spring, a reliable autumn, has changed fundamentally. One practical example is the Beirut transplanting season, when you plant Beirut trees and shrubs and fruit bushes, has been reduced by about 3 weeks over my working life. So there is uncertainty. Also this summer, the exceptionally high temperatures and the lack of rain is worse than I've ever known in Ireland. So yes, the uncertainty makes life difficult for a grower, and a grower's life has never been easy anyway. But Grow HQ, we concentrate a lot on improving the quality of the soil. And I agree completely with my fellow panelists here on how things have gone and a negative outlook. But I think it's important to try and take positive action. Otherwise, we might just give up and walk over to Wetherspoons and get drunk, really. We have to take a positive action. Do you fancy that? Yeah. Okay, see you all later then. Yeah, no, there's plenty of positive things you can actually do. And at Grow HQ, improving the quality of our soil up there, getting organic matter in through putting compost, putting green manures down. We're sequestering carbon all the time as we improve the quality of the soil. And that's given me a lot of climate resilience, I suppose, in the soil, where many crops have received no irrigation at all up there this year and are still cropping. Yeah, the carrots are a bit knobbly, potato yield is a bit down, but it needed no irrigation. So I would feel that as growers, the obvious thing we can do is improve the soil quality to improve resilience of our cropping. And in doing that, we're sequestering carbon. So one simple message, I think, really, there's things we can all do. I'm not going to talk about changing diets or driving electric cars, all the other things, but from a grower's perspective, that's what we can do.
Yeah. Kind of similar question to you, I suppose, but I want to just frame it through I suppose the experiences that you have. I know you're working on a new TV series for RTE that's going to be out and about speaking to kind of horticulturists and growers. So maybe to bring that slightly broader perspective than your own growing as well. But we've had one of the farmers that that I met over the last couple of weeks, like said, we've had sort of 3 major droughts over the last 5 years in this country, which is sort of, we see it, I think, as consumers as lovely beach weather, but farmers see it as something much more serious than that. And that has the sense that climate change, it's not coming, like it's here already for growers and farmers.
Yeah, no, totally. And just to kind of pick up on that, and honoured to be here with such a excellent, expertise on this panel or knowledge. But I suppose just to pick up on the resilience and the talking of soil, and I suppose when we're talking about food systems, for me, what's really been the biggest impact of all these global pressures is you can't talk about food without talking about seed. And I think that's been one of the major impacts on growers in Ireland is seed resilience. Because the minute Brexit hit, I think over 90% of our commercial seed it comes from the UK because we've got similar climates. So that really forced the question of where is our seed coming from? The world seed is being controlled by 4 companies, and 2 of them are agrochemical companies. So we are really handing over the start, the whole core of our system. So for me, I think the biggest thing I have seen, and I suppose where I'm moving in, is how can we create more resilience within Ireland as a country? So I've been taking part of a Gaia Foundation movement who's trying to upskill, bring back the knowledge, bring back the systems where us as farmers, because we can talk about the soils, but if we don't have the right seeds that have evolved over centuries and generations, we're not going to be able to solve this climate crisis. And it's funny, when you talk about scarcity, I brought along some seed that I saved this year from literally like a half a metre of plants. The abundance is there, but we're actually just outsourcing it. So there's been really interesting movements. I suppose I move in a lot of organic circles, and that's why it was really interesting for me doing that TV show, because I found myself talking with we need scaled up farming if we're going to have a proper Irish food system, and how can we do that in a more sustainable way? Because there are the challenges, and I suppose within the organic sector, a lot of people were importing their seed, importing their transplants. So the Irish organic growers got together, and there's now a person with the skills in Dublin who's raising the transplants and actually equipping the organic farmers. But when I visited lots of big operations in Dublin, from tomato growers to salad growers, they're all buying in all their transplants. This is all dependent on fuel. This is all dependent on oil. This is all outsourced. So I really think we need to start looking, and I think how we can work better together as a community in Ireland and actually give the contracts, give the business, because for you to grow seed, it's a very expensive thing to do. But if our actual growers start teaming up with more Irish startup businesses that can help them produce the seed, I think that's the way we're going to form resilience. And I know that was probably a very off-topic rant, but I suppose for me to be here on a food security, I just really think we have to get back to the seed.
We do live in a global world, and like our food system is like, I suppose it's become this monolith, like dominated by very small number of crops, very small number of companies, and like famously, I suppose our former Taoiseach and soon to be current Taoiseach Leo Varadkar talks about how we're producing enough food to feed like 10 times our population, or 9 times, I think he says. But really that hides a sort of reality that mainly what we're producing is cows. Isn't that fair to say? And like, what's your sense of the sort of the security we have as an island nation in an increasingly kind of crisis-ridden, climate change-ridden world? Like, where do we stand on the kind of the security of our food supply here?
If I were to juxtapose 2 events that we all witnessed if we were watching over the last couple of weeks. One was the arrival in Foynes Harbour of a ship recently released from Ukraine. It arrived into Foynes Harbour, 28,000 tonnes of grain. Every one of those tonnes for animal feed. Okay? So, like getting precious grain out of a war-torn country to bring it to a rich first world country to feed animals. That's the first thing. The second thing is, what are we doing with that? Switch to the other side of the world. Our Agriculture Minister, Charlie McConalogue, has just been on a marketing blitz in Southeast Asia, promoting Irish agriculture at a cost to us, the taxpayer, of €8 million to promote high cost, high value, high end agricultural output. So there's one particular company in Singapore, and it sells a high-end Irish Angus steak. It's a chilled steak that is flown in weekly from Ireland into Singapore, selling for €72 a kilogram, which is fantastic for business. But the question is, what is this for food security? Right? Now, to go back, Michael, to your, and I know it's not your figure, but this widely trumped figure about us feeding 40 million people. Now, if you give 40 million people a hamburger, have you fed 40 million people, or have you given 40 million people a hamburger? Because there's some very clever sophistry going on here. What the public understand by the phrase feeding 40 million people is providing the nutritional needs over a year for 40 million people. We're doing nothing of the sort. 90% of our agricultural output in Ireland is for export. It's heavily subsidised, both domestically and at EU level. We're then exporting that, but we are importing 80% of all the food in an Irish supermarket is imported. We import 50,000 tonnes of potatoes from the UK. Potatoes, carrots, onions, etc. Things that are perfectly, apples, pears, things that grow perfectly in Ireland, we import them. Our horticulture sector in this country has been almost wiped out. It's approximately 1% of agriculture is horticulture. Horticulture, hectare for hectare, has more capability to feed human beings than any other food system. There's simply no comparison. The amount of land required to feed an animal, to turn that into feed for humans. Let me give you a simple example. Let's take a beef steak, right? Now, if you take the initial energy required to input into that animal, by the time that has gone through the animal's digestive system and wastes, etc., and by the time you get the steak and you eat a beef steak, you've had an energy loss of between 95 and 99%. It's a fabulously inefficient way of feeding human beings, if that's our concern. And I think in a climate-altered, war-torn, food-stressed world, we need to think very carefully about where we're placing these valuable food resources. And is it ethical, for example, in Ireland, to have a food system that is aimed at supplying food for the tables of Dubai and for example, to encourage women in China to stop breastfeeding so that they can instead use powdered Irish dairy milk and to be involved in the marketing of that? Is that sustainable in some way? And if I can loop back to what Kitty said as well, I think it's incredibly important to say that apart from our 1% horticulture, less than 2% of the land of Ireland is organically farmed. This is the second lowest in the entire European Union. The average in the European Union is about 10%. That means that 98% of the land in Ireland is farmed chemically. Now, when you say organic farming, a lot of people think, oh, well, you know, that's that hippie people. Organic farming is what our grandparents called farming. It means making do with the land, working the land. Chemical farming means overwhelming the land and basically forcing food out of it. Now, that system depends on imported fossil fuels, imported chemical nitrogen, imported pesticides, imported fuel. All of these, so our entire agricultural system, our export-based system, is predicated on imports. Some of these imports, by the way, where does our fertilizer come from? 20% of the fertilizer that was poured onto Irish lands, over-poured onto Irish lands last year, came from Russia. So where's it going to come from next year? We have a system where we're totally input dependent. Now, you might ask, why are we so keen on all these inputs? Who's pushing it? Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I genuinely am not. But I can promise you this. The multi-billion euro agri-PLCs have a massive interest in encouraging, cajoling, leaning on our farmers and our agriculture system to use their inputs as much as possible, to use the treated seeds, to use the imported chemical nitrogen and to become dependent on pesticides. And of course, when you are in a system that is dependent on nitrogen and pesticides, you're caught in a trap, because if you stop using them, your food system collapses. I would suggest that for the food resilience that we're going to need over the next decade or two, we're going to have to learn how to farm without all these artificial supports, because my guess is that one of these days those artificial supports either will not be available or will be so expensive as to be impossible to obtain. So now is the time. I mean, for example, the EU set a target of 25% of the land of Europe to be farmed organically by 2030. We're at 1.7% in Ireland. And when do you hear Charlie McConalogue on the radio saying we need to match our reputation, our so-called green reputation, by pushing organic farming? Because organic farming means learning how to farm with nature and learning how to farm without these chemical inputs, these imported inputs that make our system fragile and incredibly dependent. And what scares me about the future isn't really farm incomes as such. That is a worry. What scares me about the future is hunger. And I don't mean hunger in Africa, as Steve alluded to. I mean hunger in Ireland. It is in our DNA. We understand genetically what hunger means. And it would be the greatest tragedy of this century if hunger again visits this country. And right now, we are not food secure by any means.
Yeah. Steve, we were filming in your farm in Bantry, but we also filmed with a farmer here in Waterford who's kind of adapted a regenerative approach, and he like talked about how his yields were gone up and his veterinary bills had gone down and so on. And I was kind of asking him if this is a way to produce food organically in a way that's so good for you, increases your income, reduces your costs and so on. Why isn't everybody doing this? And he was making the point that there's very little bit money to be made in regenerative agriculture, in the sense that the big agri-businesses and so on that want to sell the fertilizers and the pesticides and all the chemicals, and then also the veterinary supplies and the medicines and things like that, that was his sense that there's a vested interest in keeping regenerative agriculture and organic agriculture down. Would you buy that idea, or what's been your sense of the agencies of state, I suppose, and agri-businesses that you've had to interact with?
I think it's an economic issue, in that damaging products such as beef, lamb, pork, they're too cheap. And so I have a very small herd of Dexters up the mountain that I have to only give them a tiny bit of protein in the winter, but they eat essentially the mountain grass, and I make my manure to make my potting compost from them. So they're part of an integrated system. And I was selling my beef for 3 times the price of beef in the supermarket, and I still wasn't breaking even. And the trouble is, damaging products such as beef are just way, way too cheap. And I think, you don't have to be absolutist. There was a very interesting report, the Eat Lancet report, where they got nutritionists together and they got environmentalists together, and they said, look, what is a sustainable diet for the planet? And it was a very, very low meat diet, a low dairy diet, a high pulse, a high grain, high vegetable diet. And when meat is so cheap, people aren't going to move to that. So I think a lot of it's an economic, rather than, there's no one planning this. It's just the way, if you've got a massive farm with massive machinery and you've got cheap access to inputs, you can produce incredibly cheap meat and still make a profit. Now that will change as, fertilizer, the nitrogen fertilizer they use on grass has gone up 3-fold. Yeah. Diesel's gone up 3-fold. Animal feed's gone up 3-fold just in the last year. So these economic conditions will change. But the problem is, you can't suddenly one day be a conventional farmer poisoning your land with sprays with high nutritional fertilizers, and then the next day suddenly be a regenerative farmer, because the ecology in the soil, and we're saying about the carbon you've put in the soil, conventional farming with chemicals actually lowers the amount of carbon and it kills soil life. And so then if you stop using those, that soil is essentially barren initially or very, very low productive. And it takes time to put the nutrients back in, to get the fungi going, to get the bacteria going, the protozoa going, and to develop this sort of, they call it a soil food web, this sort of interaction of life. And it cannot happen overnight. And so, you know, we've got a system, it's like a super tanker, and it needs to change quickly, but super tankers can't turn direction quickly. But the sooner you start turning direction, the better. And my worry is that with these shocks, you know, say in Africa, because of COVID, we saw malnutrition rates increase over threefold. That's my speciality, is starvation. They reach over threefold because, as John was saying, farmers in Africa are dependent on international systems to provide their grain, to provide their fertilizer, and the logistics. We had a logistic breakdown, and that very quickly translated into malnutrition. And that, you know, I totally agree. That can happen here. And you can't suddenly change. So we have to start changing now. I mean, that's why I'm here. I think what Grow Your Own is doing, it's great, you know, because it's starting to change that mindset. But it needs to happen as fast as possible because time is running out.
John, you might just pick up your microphone because I think there's a little bit of feedback coming from that. Thanks. Katie, one of the things that always strikes me as odd is I think John mentioned like the sort of decimation that's happening in the horticulture, like growers leaving in their droves and so on, and there is that slightly odd at a time when, you know, all of the scientists I think agree that we need to move towards a more plant-based diet, whether you believe in eating meat or not. I think we need to eat more plants according to all of the accepted sort of science on it. And at a time when it could be Irish horticulture's moment in the sun, it seems like it's the opposite, that we're losing all that expertise that we've had for hundreds of years. What did you see when you were out recording for the new TV series? In that, is there hope there, do you think?
Yeah, like it's definitely a challenge. And, you know, I suppose a phrase that comes bandied around a lot and I really like, it's like the world, we don't need more mass-produced food, we need more food produced by the masses, you know. So exactly to link in what you're doing, you know, we need more localised systems. You know, I don't come from a vegan perspective. I don't think we'll ever grow great veg on the hilltops in Connemara, but, you know, just more localised systems are needed. Yeah, it's been a really interesting one. Like, it definitely, from doing the show, it really kind of re-emphasises kind of go big or go home. You know, people really have to scale up to kind of try and compete and make any margins. And, you know, I suppose it's more tillage than horticulture, but my family farm, my brother has organic gluten-free oats business, micro mills on the farm. And, you know, he's got 4 kids, trying to put them all through college. And maybe sometimes I come by the more hippie idealist, and it's kind of like, yeah, it's not all about the money and we can do this and grow more seed. But the realism, when you're trying to keep a show on the road, you know, people have to pay their bills and people have to eat. And it is really unfortunate that the people who feed us and the people who try and feed us nutritionally don't get 20 days holidays. They don't get 5 days holidays. They're not enjoying the heat wave. They're not, you know, it's a tough, I think I can see some growers here among us, you know, who probably weren't off gallivanting for the summer. So it is tough, but I have to say, in my work for the OGI and coordinating the Small Growers Network, which basically is aimed at an organisation to help people in the start-up phase of market gardening. And there's a great community out there. And there definitely is hope, because the rewards are strong. It's definitely a lifestyle choice as much as it is a career choice. Because if you were going to do the maths and go, okay, I'm going to work every hour God send, I'm going to get no holidays, and I'm going to earn feck all money, and I'm going to live on 12 grand a year, you'd probably go, no, I don't think this is the one for me. But thankfully, most people are in it for the love of the land, the love of the actual reward, the bigger picture, and what you can do, and just being out there and being able to provide a local community and go out, and whether you choose to sell through farmers' boxes, through farmers' markets or CSAs, there definitely is a reward from that. So from the small growers, there's been more activity, more young people joining. I think there's an awareness, all the information that GIY, that certain media are doing. People are aware that climate change is real, and really how we choose to eat and how we choose to grow is an absolutely huge, huge indicator. And you can see, I think when I was a teenager, drinking was cool. We were all out drinking flagons and cans. Now you're having your oat milk and you're this and you're that. There's a new consciousness coming, and I think there is a new wave. So I suppose I'm not sure if I'm really kind of answering that. With all the big, I think there's smaller community movements happening as well, and you're seeing the regeneration of towns like Lahinch and Clare, where you have Fergal Smith and the Moy Hill crowd, and more people are moving. So there's plenty of positives out there, but I suppose it's up to people to go to your local towns, get out of the supermarkets, get down to the markets, buy, shop, make it real. It's easy talk, but if we don't actually get out and support and eat with the seasons and buy from the people who are sacrificing everything to mine nature and feed us, the whole system's going to fail.
It does feel like some of the kind of the most exciting innovations are not the guys who are going bigger and bigger and as you said, going big or go home, but like in horticulture in Ireland at the moment, it seems like there are some really innovative sort of smaller producers. Like we've got Brian from Cork Rooftop Farm is one of the first stalls up above there. Like he's employing 4 people growing vegetables on a roof and a small market garden in Cork. Like the garlic up in Drummond House, like what you're doing with Aronia Berries on the side of a mountain and so on. It feels like that sort of innovation is kind of bubbling up. That's much smaller scale, but could be really important in the years ahead.
Definitely. And, I think tech has its role to play, and there's lots of interesting, kind of small machinery, because it is very hands-on and it's very labour intensive. So sometimes, I am a bit of a Luddite, and I'm not like, oh my God, the world's so global. I just plug it all out and just keep farming. But we are learning from our global communities as well. And I think with climate, things are shifting. They are speculating that maybe Scotland's going to become a wine producing region because all the wine producing areas are getting too hot. So we are learning from global communities, and there's a great, I think the small farming movement in California has been, way ahead, and there's been great seed companies like Johnny Seed Companies who work with growers. It's not like here we just get too specialist. The people, who are growing seeds don't have anything got to do with the farmers. You know what I mean? People are cooking and they're not talking to growers, So I think there's a whole, people who are creating tools are now working with farmers to try and get more mechanized ways of doing low impact farming, and I think that's exciting times as well.
Richard, we've visited a farmer called Colin Flynn up in County Kildare, I think, and he was saying that for him he's a large scale cereal crop grower, and he mentioned like his kind of road to Damascus moment happened about 10 years ago. He was ploughing the field and noticed for the first time there was no birds following the plough anymore, which is like it's your absolutely quintessential rural image, crows following the plough to pick up the insects that are turned up. And it started a journey for him of realizing that his soil, even though it was very productive, it was dead in terms of its biology. Like, I know you've worked very hard on the soil at Grow HQ and so on, but what sort of changes have you seen to the biodiversity in the soil and just in the environment in general in terms of kind of bees and insects that are around? What changes have you seen over the last sort of 5 years?
I suppose we're talking about a climate crisis, but we're also talking about a biodiversity crisis happening in the world. And our remit, or my remit, I suppose, in Grow HQ is to produce a lot of tasty veg with the minimum damage to the environment possible, i.e. to tread as lightly on the earth as we can. And there's no contradiction for me in having a very vibrant population of pollinators. The flip side for that, if I create a viable population of pollinators, I also get a good population of predatory insects. And although as an organic grower, I would be allowed to use certain plant extracts as insecticides, I don't use them. I spray nothing at all. And I know when I get aphids, green flies, black flies attacking things, the ladybird larvae, the ladybirds will be eating them very quickly. They come out of the hedgerow as well. So it's creating a whole vibrant ecosystem in the soil. The visible sign, is earthworms, and they're certainly increasing a lot in numbers. My eyesight's not good enough to see all the bacteria and amoeba and so on, and the fungal hyphae in the soil. I can smell it, or maybe that's me, I'm not too sure, but I think I can smell it anyway. But critically, I can see the impact of that, which is plants that, to some extent, look after themselves. I don't spray for aphids, as I was saying. The soil doesn't need anywhere near as much irrigating, and nutrition of the plants. Have some lovely examples at the moment in areas of soil that we've worked on for a couple of years, and ones that were only recently started, where the plants are so much healthier. So I suppose the visible sign, if you come to Grow HQ, would be you see a lot of butterflies and bees around, bumblebees and so on. We have an excellent population. But also you'll see very healthy looking crops even after a drought, and crops that aren't sprayed. So there's no reason why that couldn't be scaled up. It's an attitude, and I'm certainly not anti-scale. I'm anti-bad farming. Yeah. And there's certain people who think big and operate on a big scale, and they can incorporate the innovations necessary on a bigger scale. I'm more a smaller scale, intensive grower, so that's where I do it.
You'll hear, and I have heard it on the radio, like representatives from Teagasc and other organisations saying we don't have the climate and we don't have the soil to grow vegetables on a scale that we can grow grass for feeding cows. But it feels like you look around you and you can see growers and farmers growing vegetables perfectly well. There seems to be that mismatch between those two things.
Yeah, there's certain areas of Ireland are a lot better than others. In terms of soil and climate, and obviously the east of the country is much better to grow veg in. Mavericks can grow fruit on acidic hillsides in West Cork, I'm sure. But I prefer an easier route. And as you know, Mick, when we're looking for new sites or whatever, I look at the soil first. So it's important, I think, if you want to grow veg on scale, that you choose the right site.
Yeah.
Obviously, you can grow anywhere, but it's hard work. So make it as easy as you can for yourself. But Ireland has a reasonable climate to grow certain things in, but not others. A quite sustainable diet would be chips and mushy peas, which keep me happy anyway. You don't have to look for something coming from exotic climates. We can grow pulses, but peas, field beans, those sort of things we should be looking at, and growing working with what we can grow well rather than what we think we should be growing.
John, what about that point, and you hear it trotted out quite a lot actually, that our what we do brilliantly in this country is grow grass. It'll grow. You only look at the side of the roads and it grows our climate is brilliant for it, and so we should specialise in that, and other parts of the world should specialise in other things, and that the global food system should be set up like one big massive crop rotation effectively. What about that point, do you think, that we should focus on what we're good at?
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that point. However, since 1970, the amount of land under tillage in Ireland has gone down by more than 50%. So we've actually, this monocultural industrialization of the countryside is a recent phenomenon. And of course, it's really a recent phenomenon since about 2014, when the milk quotas were lifted and we've had the rush to dairy expansion. So, yeah, I mean, we are suitable for grass growing, but we're also suitable for all kinds of growing. And I think it is really important to say we're going to need to produce lots of food for people. There's just no getting away from that. Now, small-scale organic has a role. Of course it does, particularly at community level and so on. However, if you want to look at doing large-scale food production in the most sustainable way possible, well, I would suggest you look at what they do in Holland, right? Holland is a tiny country the size of Munster. It has a population of 17 million people, yet it is the world's second largest food exporter. Now, how the heck does a tiny country, densely populated, produce the second, after the USA, the world's second largest food exporter? How do they do it? The miracle of Dutch food production is not their dairy sector, which is the protests and fights you've seen. That's been about trying to scale back their dairy sector. The miracle of Dutch agricultural productivity is they have 36 square miles of greenhouses. They've developed hydroponic systems. And by the way, by moving their agricultural system under glass, they've protected it from the elements. They've allowed, for example, to recycle water through the system. And by the way, by farming indoors, they've largely eliminated the use of pesticides because they can actually control the space. So I strongly recommend look up, there are videos, there's articles about the Dutch agriculture, the horticultural model that they have produced with minimal inputs and absolutely staggering outputs. Now, some of it is not so practical. For example, they produce huge amounts of flowers for sale all over the world. Okay, you can't eat them. I appreciate that's not a solution, but it's a commercial product. But the point is, when we use our noggins and our technology, we can actually, on a relatively small amount of land, produce a vast amount of food. Now, this is important, the amount of land taken up for food production. And let me explain why. If you take all the world's agricultural land to date, 83% of it is given over to livestock production. Either the land that the animals directly feed on or land sequestered for food production to feed to animals. 83%. Now, how much of the primary calorie production of the world do we derive from livestock? 18%. 34% of protein, 18%. So basically, 1/4 of the world's land is feeding 3/4 of the world's population. And the notion of a high meat-based diet, this is a completely Western conceit. If you go to many countries, large countries, meat is the last thing on the diet. It's there, but it is literally, it's the top of the pie. I mean, the phrase carnival, right? That phrase carnival comes from the Latin word carnis, which means meat. It's a celebration. And what do you do at a celebration? You have some meat. In other words, it's in our history that meat is an add-on to our diet. It was never the core of our diet. But we've been propagandized, I would suggest, very effectively to believe, in fact, that meat should be at the center of our diets. And I think that's because, again, the folks that are pushing that particular message.
Are there any questions from the audience? We might just wait till we get a microphone. Barry, would you mind bringing that so we can hear the question there? We've got about 10 minutes left, so we might take a couple of questions from the audience.
Hi, my name is Marie Antoinette. I'm a junior minister, and I'm just interested in your question in relation to Leo Varadkar, and what way do you think the government could help you in relation to what you're speaking about? And I'm very interested in what you have to say, so thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for coming. John, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think the reference was to the feeding 40 million people. Yeah, I mean, the facts are there that Ireland is a net importer of food energy. This has been confirmed by the UN FAO, that's the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. When they add up all the food outputs from a country, and then they look at all the energy inputs to food production, we are importing the equivalent of enough food to feed 2.5 million people. So the only thing we're exporting at the moment in Ireland is food insecurity. And I hope that folks like Leo Varadkar will have that conversation and look at the data.
maybe just to add on that, I do really
Barry.
think that organic agriculture, it does have a huge role to play in the biodiversity challenge and the climate change challenge. And organic really has become the left of centre. You know, it's not really anyway funded. There's very little supports, very little research being carried out. I was one of the fortunate ones who got to do a master's in organic horticulture, but that programme has now finished. It's ran out of funding. We don't have any organic research centres in Ireland. You know, we need to help farmers along, and I do really think, as we're saying, we're trying to now. The organic farming scheme hopefully we will reach the 5% target, but it's a lot of dry stock entrants, which is great. It's definitely a bonus, but I just think more supports in the organic department.
Yeah,
as
and
well.
the research point is critical, because research follows money, and I think that's why there isn't as much research happening in organics. Sorry, Steve, do you want to come in?
As well, I think from a government perspective, you've got a double win here, in that you've got almost 30% of the Irish population, adult population, is suffering from metabolic syndrome, this constellation of central obesity, high blood pressure, poor blood fats and pre-diabetes. And that's driven by a high sort of a sugar diet and a high bad fat diet. And it's a huge cost. But Ireland can produce good veg, good green veg. It produces good berries with very high polyphenol, very high sort of protective chemicals that reduce the risk of metabolic syndrome. And so we can produce by diversifying, and government giving incentives to diversify into food products that grow well here, that are also healthy. You can actually save on your public health bill, as well as making your agriculture more resilient. So it's not all, it's very easy to be feeling a bit depressed and doom and gloom about the climate change. But there are changes that can actually be not even cost neutral, but actually cost positive. You can actually get returns on your investment from public health as well.
I mentioned Aronia Berries probably once or twice. Do you want to just explain to people what they are, so people
Thanks,
know?
So basically, everyone's heard of superfoods. Now, superfoods nutrition, it's not very well defined, but a good definition would be a food high in compounds called polyphenols, which are plant immune compounds, but they have an amazing effect in protecting metabolism. So they lower blood glucose, and they stop diabetes, they stop heart disease, and they stop central obesity. And you've heard of things like acai berries that we import from Brazil at incredibly high cost and very, very polluting. Well, Aronia berries that I've shown will grow on very, very marginal land, 200 metres, full view of the Atlantic, on the worst soil. Well, it's not even soil, it's grey clay. They grow really well here. And so there's a crop that's crying out, because at the moment, all of my neighbours, they work so hard, these farmers. And they're struggling more and more, trying to produce more silage for more cattle and losing more money in doing it. And there's no alternatives. And so as government, you can push these alternatives. And crops that work well, so these Aronia berries that have been shown now, I've converted, say, an acre of my high mountain, which had it produced one lamb a year, I would have been doing well. Now, one lamb sells for about €50, mountain lamb. So I'd be getting €50 turnover on that acre. This year, 3 years after producing those bushes, I'm getting about €2,000 turnover on that land with a food that's really good for you. And the other benefit is, at the moment, it's the worst of all worlds. When you have these mountain sheep, there's very low density, so they produce very little food. But what they do, every time a tree pops up above the grass, it gets nibbled. And so I've got an area where I just excluded all animals. Within 10 years, I've got woodland there. I've got birch, I've got willow, I've got some rowan in there. Just come up naturally. But the sheep are stopping that. So rewild some of it, and then on the rest of it, grow these nutritious berries. I mean, it's not a solution for the whole of Ireland, but for certain places like the valley I live in southwest Ireland, it's an incredibly positive solution to both public health and productivity in marginal land.
And Steve is 95 as well, so he looks really well on those Aronia berries. You have a question there.
My name is Katrina English. The knowledge here today is fantastic, and what struck me is we're producing so much food in Ireland, but yet there's so many people going hungry. For me, it's like a class system. Like, there's only so many people can afford to buy organic or can afford to buy off farmers' markets. And that's understandable. There's a lot of work goes into it. But how do we get the information and education to children or to people that wouldn't normally see it or hear it? Like here today, I'm sitting here today, I wouldn't have known half this stuff that you're saying. You know, we need to get the education maybe into schools more or start them younger.
Yeah.
You know, if the planet is in so much trouble, we need to start with the small people.
Yeah, brilliant point. And we do have a session later on, I think at 4:00 about exactly that topic. But Kitty, maybe do you want to speak to that point? Because there is a kind of slight rock and a hard place here where we're sort of complaining about the 49-cent carrots because it's putting growers out of business. And yet, if you need to feed a family, 49-cent carrots are great. Like, so how do you square that circle?
Oh, God, it's such a tough one. Honestly, it's something that goes around my head every single day. It's how do we make this more accessible? As a grower who knows the inputs and the work, and to sell a head of cabbage for 50 cents, it just doesn't work. And I do agree that the whole organic, it is become more of a posh food, a posh world. And maybe I don't know. I'm not throwing back everything to policy and accessibility, but I do think there's a lot more that could be done with that. Like Richard and me, we both met through school garden work, and that's it's basically it's very hard as groups of individuals to kind of make it work because you're trying to growing and then you're going into schools. I know there's a program that Board Bia have running at the moment, Incredible Edibles, and I'm sorry, I can't help but be hugely critical about it. It's like 4 million budget going into buying veg from, I don't know where, Holland, chopped up and put into plastic bags and sent from a fridge using more fossil fuels into our schools. We could be doing more. So I think the bridge, that 4 million should be going into local growers, local to the schools. So there's a budget to put the bus on the road to get the kids out onto the farms, like you do in GIY, Airfield Estate in Dublin. But that's got to reach in Dublin where the children can come on buses, because the schools are challenged as well. You talk to the teachers, they're up to their max, They don't have the time to go out, and suddenly they're trying to be garden teachers as well. So I think we need to start looking. I think, as I said, this Incredible Edible Food Dudes, or whatever they call it, it's definitely a start in the right direction. But I think whoever's making the decisions needs to get wider input from actually growers and people on the ground, and not people in offices maybe who think this is a great idea.
Yeah, we should be stuffing them with Aronia berries, I think.
Well, exactly.
Well, and there's a cultural thing. Coming as a sort of with a doctorate in nutrition, but also I've studied anthropology. There's a cultural thing in Ireland, the idea of a treat. Now, as a nutritionist, I see a treat as something that poisons children, and it's addictive. When it's a high sugar treat, it's addictive. So it's like, oh yeah, let's give them a little bit of cocaine because they've been good. It's madness. A berry, our children won't eat. If you don't program a child to eat sweet food when they're young, they don't get a taste for it. And our children can eat anything they want, apart from they won't want to eat sweet stuff. And that is a change that it has to start from the mentality of us as adults. We can't say, oh, you've been really good, here, have a bit of poison. You've been really good, have a carrot or have a fresh apple or have a berry. And it's a small point, but I think that could have a real healthy outcome. Yeah.
Great point, yeah. Any last questions or comments from the audience? Yes, this lady here. We'll get a microphone to you there.
Susan Gallagher is my name. You've sort of touched on it, but I'm just wondering what role community gardens that grow for their own benefit, or even individuals, ordinary people growing vegetables, is there a role there for them?
Yeah,
Thanks.
Great question. Thank you, Richard. Do you want to take that? What role can community gardens and individual growers play in all of this?
I think just briefly on the last question, if I may, it relates to that. The problem with the cost of healthy food relates to the previous question as well, I think. The whole system in Ireland is skewed to subsidising an unhealthy diet.
Yeah.
the average beef cow, beef animal coming out, or sheep, is being heavily subsidised, whereas when I was a commercial organic veg producer, I received no subsidy whatsoever. I relied on the market. So people talk about organic growing being non-commercial. If I was the commercial producer and the average suckler farmer or sheep farmer wasn't, so if the subsidies are directed in the right place, then the food will be, good food would be affordable for people on low incomes. But in terms of the ultimate affordability, I suppose, is having your own allotment or your own community garden. It can play a massive role. I originally was brought up in England, and there you had a legal right to an allotment going back to the acts in the 19th century, which meant that everybody had the right to grow their own food. And that can be a massive saving. So yes, community gardens can have a huge role, and the allotment sites owned by the council used to function as a community garden. You learn from the older, well, it was nearly always guys, but now obviously it's not, but you learn from the older people there. Knowledge was passed on. So I think that's a crucial thing. Rather than working on your own, you're working in a community where you're learning and skills are being passed on, knowledge and inputs are being shared. So I think that is possibly the ultimate form of food resilience, people growing their own food and acting as a community. That's how it's always been done in the past. And I think we've just had a brief hiatus of madness for 50 or 60 years, where we poison the earth, buy food, transported halfway around the world. And I think we're moving back to a time when people will grow together, and we're probably better for it in the long term.
Great point, Richard. Yeah, could I ask each of you just for a final comment then, just to wrap things up? I suppose about maybe what what are the core things you think we need to change to sort of try and coming back to our original kind of our topic point, which we've certainly meandered around a little bit over a fascinating hour. Around creating a more resilient food system. John, maybe to you first. What do you think we need to do?
Yeah, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we're exiting the phase of stable climatic conditions. I think the remarkable run of cheap food, as Richard just described, this idea basically of spraying our way and nitrogening our way into massive production of food and then massive production of cheap food. I think it has broken the connection between people and food, because if you think about it, the most primary thing, in fact, up to maybe a century ago, 80 to 90% of people were farmers. We've always been farmers. Everybody's been a farmer. Now, if I were to make a prediction for 2050, I believe that 80 to 90% of Irish people will be farmers in 2050. They will be small allotment farmers, small holding farmers, and we'll go back. The wheel turns, and we will go back in the next 20 or 30 years. Not, by the way, because that's what we choose to do, but because we have no choice. And that's why between now and then, we need to learn the skills. We need to relearn the skills that our ancestors have always understood, that the primary condition for humans is to be connected to the land and to be able to feed ourselves. We have completely severed that. We as a society, as a community, we are as helpless as kittens. We're absolutely at the mercy of long supply chains about which we know nothing and over which we have no control. So it is time, and if you'll pardon me for borrowing a phrase from our neighbours across the way, it's time to take back control. Thank you.
Well done, John. Yeah. Katie, what do you think?
I think a lot, but maybe to echo that, and I'm thinking, I'm just not thinking, because John said it so well that I'm just going to re-echo that. But I think there is something in it, isn't it? And it is really kind of corny, but it's just like literally by just sowing one seed and growing a little bit of lettuce, it just restores, it just reconnects with something called abundance. Because if you do listen to global the global news, it's just so freaking depressing. But I think there's something in, everyone's back garden. But the urban movement is really strong at the moment. And from growing and thinking about your waste. So not only grow your own food, compost your own food, or just get a wormery, or just think about closing systems, because it actually emanates what's going on in a global system. It's broken. The system is broken. And all we can do as each one individual is just trying to adopt healthy patterns in our own life. And then as you adopt them, you share them with others. So there is kind of old terms, do it for yourself, and then just be that really annoying person over coffee or lunch, but just tell 2 other people or even 5 what you're doing, and then just spread the word on a grassroots level. So grow, compost, and tell everyone what you're doing.
Very good. Over to you, Steve.
I think I'm going to come back to Richard's point about the subsidies, actually. That this idea that you can't suddenly go organic, you can't suddenly build soil health, it takes time. And you have this interim period where your productivity will go down. And so the role of subsidies, and I think there has been this new cap, I welcome it. I think it's finally a step in the right direction. But we haven't got much time. This is happening. It's not a linear process. When I see famine or food insecurity in Africa, it's not a linear program. As systems break down, you get negative feedback loops that come and they further aggravate the causes of that breakdown, and it goes very fast. And where I think we are starting to enter that. And so the role of government support to allow people to transition to more sustainable agriculture, I think it's really vital.
A huge thanks to my guests John Gibbons, Steve Collins, Kitty Scully and Richard Mee. For more on these issues, check out the GIY website at giy.ie, and also the website for our new TV series Food Matters, which is foodmatterstv.ie. There's loads more information on these very topics. Hope you can join us for the next episode of Food Done Right.